Okay, so today we're talking about cardiac output. So we're talking about how we control how much blood gets out to the body, out to that systemic circuit, out to all our organs. Remember, it's going to all those organs in parallel. Okay, so we want to understand how this is controlled. And there are a lot of different factors that are going to influence how much blood is going out to the body. So we're going to start off with a poll question right here, quick. You can see it up on the screen. I will pull up our answer options. Here we go. Okay, so we've talked about some of these different branches of the nervous system. We want to think about which we would expect to influence contractile events in the heart. Okay, take a last second. I'm going to end the polling. Okay. So I've got a couple different ideas about this. The answer should be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, answer E. So it should be just A and B. So cardiac muscle is distinct from skeletal muscle. That's why it's not C. The somatic nervous system affects only skeletal muscle, but both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous branches, so those two branches of the autonomic nervous system, the rest and digest and the fight or flight, both of those are going to be able to influence the heart. So we'll see that during times of stress, when the sympathetic nervous system is active, we're going to see the heart contracting more forcefully. We're going to see heart rate rise, therefore increasing the amount of blood going out to the body. And in times of rest, we're going to see that the heart rate will slow down. Slow down, we don't need to rush blood out that rapidly. We're not running away, so our skeletal muscle tissue isn't being greedy about oxygen. So we'll see that we slow down. So this equation that's up is really important. This is going to summarize how any of these changes are going to affect cardiac output. So we're going to be looking into things that affect both the heart rate, so how fast the heart is beating, and also things that affect stroke volume, which is basically, right, how effective the heart is going to be at getting all that blood out. Remember when we were looking before at our end diastolic volume compared to our stroke volume, compared to our end systolic volume, we saw that about only 54% of that blood was being pumped out to the body at rest. And we're going to be able to increase that stroke volume under certain conditions. So cardiac output, the amount of blood sent out to the body through the systemic circuit, is equivalent to the stroke volume. So how much blood in milliliters any one heartbeat sends out, times the number of times it beats in a minute, right? So times the heart rate. So our cardiac output is basically going to be how much blood is sent out to the body in a minute, because that's the units on our heart rate. On average, the cardiac output is 5 liters per minute at rest. Your average blood volume is 5.5 liters. So we're getting almost all the blood in our body cycling around in any given minute. So we're reoxygenating all that blood, sending out new fresh oxygen. Okay. So our two factors that equation tells us that we're going to be looking at are the heart rate and the stroke volume. And we're going to see that there are both extrinsic and intrinsic factors that regulate heart rate and stroke volume. When we say extrinsic, we mean things from outside the heart coming in and having an effect on the heart. So that's going to be our nervous system, right? Because that's coming from the brain, from the spinal cord, and hormones, our endocrine system, right? So something being made by your adrenal gland, right? Extrinsic to the heart. Intrinsic regulation is going to happen due to factors about the heart itself. So that's going to be things like how stretched the muscle is, how much volume is in there, things like that. Those will be intrinsic to the heart itself. Okay. So here, hopefully we vaguely recognize this diagram, right? What we're looking at is the spinal cord. We see highlighted in green, we have the lumbar thoracic region that creates the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And here at the top, we see one of our cranial nerves, the vagus nerve, which carries parts of the parasympathetic nervous system. So that the rest and digest branch of the autonomic nervous system. So both our parasympathetics and our sympathetics contribute innervation to the heart. So an important thing we want to notice here before we go into the effects of the parasympathetics and the sympathetics on the heart, other than the fact that both of them are going there, so we should expect to see effects of both on the heart. And we'll actually learn that at any given moment, right, both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are active and acting on the heart. There's just a balance back and forth between which one's more active and which one's less active. But we'll notice where they're going. So we have parasympathetic innervation via the vagus nerve to the atria, going to both the SA node here and to the AV node. Sympathetic cardiac nerves are going those same places, right? SA node, AV node. But we also have sympathetic innervation to the ventricular myocardium. So to the ventricles themselves, to that cardiac muscle itself, right? So the atria and these pacemaker cells are affected by both the parasympathetics and the sympathetics. But the ventricles are going to be affected only by the sympathetics. So we can already see that we're going to see some different characteristics between parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation just based on what part of the heart is being affected. We're going to start with heart rate. So if we remember back to that heart picture just on the previous slide, you can look at it on your slides. So heart rate is determined by the SA node. So the SA node is the pacemaker for our heart. Right? It's the one that has the fastest natural automatic, autorhythmic pace of action potentials. Right? So that heart rate determined by the SA node firing frequency, we're going to see that we have both parasympathetic and sympathetic effects on heart rate because both the parasympathetics and the sympathetics have connections to the SA node. So the intrinsic firing rate for the SA node is 100 action potentials per minute. But if you've ever measured your heart rate before while you're just sitting around, right, that's not most people's resting heart rate. That's not a very healthy resting heart rate. Without extrinsic control of the heart, though, that's how fast it would beat. Okay. The reason that your heart rate is not beating at 100 beats per minute at rest is because of extrinsic control. So specifically, at rest, your parasympathetic nervous system dominates. So your parasympathetic nervous system at rest is suppressing the firing of the SA node. It's suppressing it, it's lowering the number of action potentials in any given minute. So it's slowing your heart rate down from its natural pace, right? So ANS here means autonomic nervous system, if you're not sure about those abbreviations. Okay, so the firing rate of the SA node is under the control of the autonomic nervous system. It's one of our extrinsic factors, and hormones, which will be another extrinsic factor. Parasympathetic at rest is most active bringing the heart rate down to about 75 is normal for you being awake but at rest. Under conditions of stress, excitement, exercise, the sympathetic nervous system takes over and your heart rate increases. So we could bring it up to 100. We could bring it up above 100. I used to wear a Fitbit when I first started teaching, and I noticed I'd spike to, like 135, 150 when I got up. I used to be afraid of public speaking. So that might happen to you as well when you have to get up in front of a crowd. Your sympathetic nervous system can increase your heart rate pretty high. Okay. The way this works is due to receptors in the SA node, specifically beta-1 adrenergic receptors. So in our previous unit, we talked about our adrenergic receptors. We had the alpha ones, and we had the beta ones. So the beta ones, remember, were the ones that activated cyclic AMP. That's what's happening in the SA node in response to the sympathetic nervous activity to increase your heart rate. They also do react to epinephrine. So this is part of why hormonal control, specifically the hormone epinephrine, is going to have pretty much the same effects on the heart as sympathetic activity. It's because those beta-1 receptors are responding to both, basically. Okay, so beta-1 receptors in the SA node do a couple things, one of which is that they're going to increase the open state of sodium and calcium channels, which is going to increase the rate of spontaneous depolarization. Right? We know sodium and calcium both want to get into our cells based on our natural electrochemical gradients that we've set up. So if we let more of them get in more quickly, we can depolarize more quickly, we increase the heart rate. So basically makes the cells more sensitive, right? So this is what that would look like. So here we have our beta-1 adrenergic receptor. We see norepinephrine from the sympathetic nerve itself, or epinephrine from the adrenal glands coming in here to the beta-1 receptor. It's a G protein linked receptor, so we see our G protein go off, activate this enzyme, adenylate cyclase, which uses ATP to produce cyclic AMP. So this is what we mean when we say it's exciting this cyclic AMP, it's activating the cyclic AMP pathway. Cyclic AMP has a bunch of different effects. And in the heart cells specifically, what the cyclic AMP is doing is it's joining up with a protein kinase. We don't have to worry about what those are, but think about it as another enzyme, right? That then runs over and opens up sodium channels and calcium channels. So these are specific types of sodium and calcium channels that are described in your book. I'm not worried about you knowing the names of them right now, but know that they're for sodium and for calcium. So as these travel in, membrane potential goes up, right? So we're depolarizing the cell, which means we're having more heartbeats. So that's how the sympathetic nervous system is working in those SA node cells. Okay. The parasympathetics carried by the vagus nerve basically going to have the opposite effect, right? Parasympathetics are going to slow down our heartbeat. So parasympathetics, remember that the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is a little different and it activates different types of receptors. So the types of receptors that our vagus nerve is stimulating are these muscarinic cholinergic receptors in the SA node. So the muscarinic cholinergic receptors, right, are activated by acetylcholine. That's what the parasympathetic nerves are giving off. And in this case, the response in the cell to the activation of this muscarinic cholinergic receptor in the SA node is that we're going to increase the open state of potassium channels. We're going to close some calcium channels. So potassium, we remember, wants to leave cells. So now we're letting potassium leave quickly. We're kind of blocking some of the calcium, right? Calcium is one of the things that's making the membrane potential more positive, but we're blocking it. So this has the effect of basically hyperpolarizing the cell and slowing down the rate at which we can depolarize our SA node. So we're not going to send off an action potential as easily, as quickly, because we've kind of suppressed the activity here by making these cells more negative. So this is what creates this decreased heart rate when the parasympathetic nerves are active. And so here we see an image of what that looks like. All right, so here we see acetylcholine from our parasympathetic nerve, the vagus nerve, coming into the muscarinic cholinergic receptor. So muscarinic cholinergic receptors accept acetylcholine, but they're also linked up to G proteins. So these G proteins have effects. In this case, we're closing a calcium channel and opening a potassium channel. So we're letting positive charges escape, blocking some positive charges from entering, making the cell overall more negative, which is hyperpolarization. So we can graph what this does to our membrane potential over time. So this is kind of a messy diagram, but what I'd like you to notice here is our resting membrane potential. So what we see happening here in the gray line, right, is we're starting out down here, we're kind of negative, we're depolarizing, we become positive rapidly. Then we go back down and we see the second depolarization here over at 1.2 seconds, still on the gray line. All right, so during this little window of time, we'd have 2 heartbeats, right? So this peak is basically that action potential that we're triggering, which is triggering a single heartbeat. So what this is showing us is that we can have shifts to this heartbeat, these depolarizations, by activating or increasing activity of the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. If it's the sympathetic, we're making basically the SA node more sensitive, easier to depolarize. Depolarizations are going to happen faster. So we'll see we have in green one of these sympathetic heartbeats happening before that original heartbeat at rest. If we count, we see 3 of them are happening in the same window of time. So we've got a faster heartbeat here. For the parasympathetics, which is this purple-blue line, you can see that we just have 1 depolarization, so 1 heartbeat. So we slowed it down. This is what we're doing by opening and closing those different channels. We're changing how often we can depolarize these cells. So hormonal control works similarly. Basically, we kind of want to think of hormonal control as working through the same routes that the sympathetic nervous system does to affect the heart. So the main hormone we think of as controlling heart rate is epinephrine, right? So epinephrine has the same effect as the sympathetic nervous system, right? We know epinephrine is in general linked with the sympathetic nervous system. It's being made by the adrenal medulla, right? Which is where we have sympathetic nerves going. So this all kind of makes sense. Epinephrine also increases action potential frequency at the SA node, right? It can use some of those same receptors. So it's going to increase the velocity of action potentials, and it's going to increase the velocity of action potentials in muscle fibers as well. An interesting kind of tidbit is that glucagon actually also increases heart rate. So the place we've seen glucagon before is when we were talking about the pre and post-absorptive states, when we were talking about digestion and how the endocrine system works with that. So remember that glucagon is like the opposite of insulin. So insulin was helping us digest whatever we've eaten, get glucose into our bodies. So insulin is more linked with the parasympathetic nervous system. Glucagon is therefore more linked with the sympathetics, so glucagon actually increases heart rate. We don't really think of any hormones particularly as slowing the heart rate down. We're more concerned with speeding it up here. Okay. So we do have a sort of integration of heart rate control. We don't ever have just one thing acting on the heart. We always have both our nervous branches, the sympathetics and the parasympathetics, attached to the SA node. We always have various levels of hormones circulating. So we're going to have to integrate or combine all these effects. So any amount of sympathetic activity we have is raising our heart rate. Whatever the parasympathetic nervous system is doing, however much of that is active, it's going to lower it a little bit. However much epinephrine we have raises it a little bit more. So these are kind of trade-offs. We're not going to do any specific math with this, but I do want you to kind of have a feel for that, right? They're all working at once. This is kind of a big quilt of things. Okay. So remember here, cardiac output is equivalent to stroke volume and heart rate. So we've just been talking about heart rate control, right? So we were talking about things that could increase heart rate, right? Sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine. So if we increase heart rate, keep stroke volume the same, we would increase our cardiac output. By contrast, if we decrease the heart rate, right, parasympathetic activity, suppressing SA node depolarizations, suppressing heart rate, would decrease our cardiac output for any given stroke volume. So that's how all those factors are affecting cardiac output, is by affecting this number for our heart rate, our beats per minute. So now we're going to start thinking about stroke volume, which is the other half of this equation. Okay. So the primary things we want to think about when we're thinking about stroke volume, which remember is the amount of blood in milliliters, liters, whatever units we're using, whatever physical amount of blood is squeezed out of the heart per any one heartbeat. Right. So remember that that's our end systolic volume minus our end diastolic volume minus our end systolic volume. Okay. So this is going to be affected by ventricular contractility. So ventricular contractility is related to, right, how well the ventricles can squeeze that blood out. The end diastolic volume, right? So our stroke volume is going to depend partially on how much blood is in the heart. And it's also going to depend on the afterload, which is a new concept. So the afterload is basically your heart is pumping against something, right? So there is blood in the aorta, right? And we remember that the aorta is elastic so that it can continually put pressure through our systemic circuit so that we don't have pauses in our blood flow to our organs. So that pressure in the aorta, the ventricle has to pump, has to have a greater pressure than what's in the aorta in order to open those semilunar valves in order to get its blood out. So the afterload is really that pressure that the heart is pumping against. So if we have really high pressure in the aorta, if we have really high pressure in the systemic circuit in our body as a whole, then the heart has to work harder in order to have a greater pressure, in order to open those semilunar valves, in order to send its oxygenated blood out. So that afterload is also going to make a difference for stroke volume, because if it's easier to push against that pressure, you can get more out. Okay. So in order to affect the stroke volume, we're going to have effects on each of those factors. So first, we're going to think about contractility. So basically, right, more forceful contraction means we expel more blood. Now, the sympathetic nervous system has an effect here because we have sympathetic nerves going to the ventricles. Here's where we want to remember that picture of the nerves in the heart. We do not have parasympathetic innervation of the ventricles. So they are not going to have an effect on this because they don't go there. They have no way to do it. So just sympathetic control here when we're thinking about autonomics. So our sympathetic nervous system is going to be innervating some of those cardiac muscle cells. And so they're going to be sending norepinephrine from those nerves to our beta-1 adrenergic receptors in the muscle cells, activating the cyclic AMP second messenger system, We're going to see some different effects here than in the SA node of that cyclic AMP, because we're now talking about a muscle cell rather than part of our electrical signaling pathway. But basically, what we're going to see is that the second messenger system is going to have the effect of increasing the calcium that gets into the cytosol of those cardiac muscle cells. When we have more calcium there, we can do better cross-bridge cycling, we can contract more forcefully. We're also going to see that the reuptake of calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum is faster. So we're going to see that not only is the heart going to contract more forcefully, that systole is also going to be pretty quick, because we actually want to leave enough time for diastole. We still want that ventricle to be able to fill with enough blood. So in order to speed up the heart rate, it's helpful to contract faster so that we get that blood out, but we still have enough time for the ventricle to fill. Okay. So we are going to look at a picture, which is why I didn't read out loud to you those 4 bullet points exactly. Okay, so here we have our cardiac muscle cell. We have our norepinephrine coming in from the sympathetic nervous system. Spoiler here, right? Epinephrine is going to have the same effect. So that would be a hormone, right? So they're linking up to this beta-1 adrenergic receptor. We just saw that that activates the cyclic AMP pathway. In this case, one thing cyclic AMP is doing, opening the calcium channels. So we saw that before in the SA node as well. Here's a difference than in the SA node. So here we're going to see it's also opening calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? So both of these actions are going to have the effect of increasing calcium in the cell. Remember that calcium is important for muscle contraction, right? Because it binds to troponin, pulls away the tropomyosin, allows our cross-bridge cycle to happen. So that's how those two pieces are affecting our contractility of the ventricles. And our other two pieces, all right, so piece 3 is that we're actually going to be increasing the action of actin and myosin here. So we're basically going to make this happen faster, partially by influencing the ATP. And then we're going to be increasing the reuptake of the calcium. So this calcium ATPase returns calcium to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is also going to mean our contractions are ending faster, which means we're going to leave a lot of time for the heart to fill during diastole, even though we're increasing the heart rate. Okay. So what we would see if we were looking at a graph of time versus tension in the ventricles, you'd see at rest, we got this kind of low hill, right? Takes a certain amount of time. When we have sympathetic activity, the net effect of those pieces we just talked about in the cell is that we're going to have higher tension, right? So we're going to have a more forceful contraction, but we can see that force, that peak in force of the contraction is happening sooner than at rest, and it also goes away sooner. So our contraction is also finished before our resting contraction would be over. So we can see that this would be a shorter systole, because remember that systole is the ventricles contracting. Okay. So parasympathetic innervation of the contractile cells is not significant. We don't have the vagus going to the ventricles. We don't need to think about it when we're thinking about stroke volume, just when we're thinking about heart rate here. Okay. So hormones, epinephrine binds to beta-1 adrenergic receptors, just like norepinephrine does. So epinephrine is going to have all the same effects as the sympathetic nervous system. Basically, stroke volume goes up. All right. Systole is faster, stroke volume goes up, heart is more contractile and contracting more forcefully. Thyroid hormones, insulin and glucagon actually all also increase the force of contraction. So our other hormones also have these effects. Kind of weird, but true. So a thing that can be potentially trickier to wrap your mind around is the effect of end diastolic volume on stroke volume. So this is regulated by something called Starling's law, which basically says that as we increase the end diastolic volume, we're also going to be increasing the stroke volume. Okay, so what's happening here is that when we have greater end diastolic volume, right, so when we have more blood in the heart at the end of its relaxed phase, diastole, this is stretching those muscle fibers. So this is stretching the cardiac muscle a little bit. So it is the case that muscle fibers have an optimal length. We mentioned that in like one sentence with skeletal muscle, that skeletal muscle is usually at its optimal length at rest. That's not true for the heart. So the optimal fiber length for heart muscle is at a slightly expanded version than your normal heart volume. So when we increase the size of the heart, as we're stretching the muscle fibers due to an increase in end diastolic volume, so an increase in the blood they're holding, those fibers are then closer to their optimal length, which means they can contract better, they can contract more strongly. This is why we have an increase in stroke volume. It's because we have that blood, and then we're closer to our optimal length, so we squeeze better. So a thing that could happen, right, is that we could have an increase in venous return, so an increase in venous blood to the right atrium, say, right? So then we'd fill our ventricle more quickly, right? If we have an increase in return following our sort of pressure flow through the heart, increased venous return would increase pressure in the atria, which would then move to the ventricle, so the ventricle would fill up. When our end diastolic volume, so ventricles at rest, goes up, you're going to have an increased strength of contraction and an increase in stroke volume. So all of this sort of circuit is going to be linked up together. Now we have some graphs that make attempts to explain or summarize this. So what we're looking at here is a graph of the end diastolic volume. So the amount of blood in the heart at the end of that ventricular filling phase, at the end of rest, right? So that's here on the right, versus stroke volume here on the y-axis, right? Which is going to be the amount of blood squeezed out of the heart during ventricular ejection. So as the end diastolic volume goes up, the stroke volume also goes up. It's not a linear relationship, but we do see this upwards curve, right? So more blood in the heart, more blood going out of the heart. And part of this is due to the ventricular contractility. So basically, and I'm not going to quiz you on this part of the overlapping actin and myosin, but I do like explaining stuff. So we can see that at this lower end diastolic volume, the arrangement of our actin and myosin, there's not much space here in the center where we don't have overlap. So the reason this would not be an optimal length is that when we cross bridge cycle, right, there's just not much place to go. So that's why we can't contract that forcefully, is because we're going to bump into the opposing myosin. Whereas at this more stretched state, got a little more space in the middle here. So as we pull the actin towards the center, has more room to move, so we have a more forceful contraction. So that's what's happening here with these optimal lengths. Okay. So this curve looks similar because it is. So as we have the effects of sympathetic activity on the heart, we can sort of layer these effects, right? We talked about the fact that there's sympathetic activity influencing stroke volume, but we're also thinking about the effect of end diastolic volume on the stroke volume. So this image is pulling those together. So we have our Starling curve, which is showing us the relationship between the end diastolic volume and the stroke volume. All right, so if we have higher end diastolic volume, we have higher stroke volume. What sympathetic activity does is not to change the shape of this curve. Sympathetic activity doesn't change the shape. This relationship between end diastolic volume and stroke volume follows the same like equation for the line, if you were to write an equation for the line. What it does is it shifts the curve up or down. So what we're actually saying here about ventricular contractility as relates to sympathetic activity is that increased sympathetic activity increases stroke volume for any given end diastolic volume. That's why we use the word contractility rather than like force or contractile force. It's a very subtly different concept. I don't think the difference in this concept is going to impact your performance on the exam. But if you're confused as to why the book is like very specific about using these words a little differently, this is why. It's because we have this curved relationship between end diastolic volume and stroke volume. We're making shifts to the curve rather than affecting the line itself, like making it rise more steeply or something. Okay. So because end diastolic volume has an effect on stroke volume, this means that anything that affects end diastolic volume is going to affect stroke volume and therefore affect cardiac output, right? So this is kind of a series of domino effects. So we also want to think about what is creating these different end diastolic volumes, right? Like why do we have this curve? Why would we have a low end diastolic volume? Why would we have a high one? Okay, so a couple things. A big one is that preload, this is a definition really. So preload is the end diastolic pressure. So end diastolic pressure is pretty similar to end diastolic volume. We're just measuring it slightly differently. We're measuring it in pressure instead of like in milliliters. So it's the pressure of that volume like on the walls. And this is going to be affected by a couple different things. So one thing is filling time. So if we have a slower heart rate, right? If we have a slow heart rate, this means we've got a long time between heartbeats, which means we would have a longer filling time. If we have a longer filling time, it's more time for blood to get into the ventricles. So more time to get into the ventricles, might have more blood in there. This is going to increase our end diastolic pressure, increase preload. So a longer filling time increases preload. With atrial pressure, if we have higher atrial pressure, remember the reason that blood moves from the atria to the ventricles is that it's moving down a pressure gradient, right? It's moving from high pressure to low pressure. There's a bigger difference in pressure, it moves there faster. So if we have higher atrial pressure, more blood getting into the ventricles because we're moving more blood more quickly between the atria and ventricles, which means we would have higher preload. Finally, we have central venous pressure. So central venous pressure is the pressure of blood coming back to the heart. Okay. So again, this is going to be kind of a domino effect. Blood is following pressure gradients. So if we have high central venous pressure, so high pressure in high pressure in your superior vena cava, right, coming back to the heart. Blood is following a pressure gradient, so high pressure in the superior vena cava would lead a lot of blood to get into the atria, which would then create high atrial pressure. High atrial pressure would then lead to more filling in the ventricles, which would create greater preload. Okay, so these are affecting our end diastolic volume, basically because they're getting more blood in there. Okay. Other thing we want to think about is afterload. So afterload is that pressure in the aorta during ejection. So that is what our heart is basically beating against. So if we have higher afterload, we're going to have to work harder to get blood out of the heart. So these are going to influence stroke volume. Okay. So we're going to do one question before we look at the map of everything coming together here. Okay, so take a last second here to make your choices. Okay, so I see there's some confusion here. The answer is actually C. Okay, so here is why. So when we're looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic activity in this question, we want to focus on both, right? These words decrease and increase, but we also want to focus on what they're affecting. Okay. So a lot of you chose A here, and it's true that decreased sympathetic activity would decrease the heart rate, that decreased sympathetic activity would decrease the stroke volume, and that increased parasympathetic activity would decrease the heart rate. But the reason that this is not the correct answer is that parasympathetic activity does not have an effect on stroke volume. So that's why I was trying to emphasize that the parasympathetic nerves don't go to the ventricles. So the parasympathetics are not going to affect stroke volume. So the reason answer C is correct is because it specifies that here, right? Our sympathetic activity, when it decreases, when it goes down, this decreases stroke volume and heart rate. And when we increase parasympathetic activity, that affects cardiac output specifically by decreasing the heart rate, but it's not having any effects on stroke volume. Okay. This is on here. One thing I think I didn't mention here why we were talking about preload, but explained a lot about preload. But increased preload is going to increase stroke volume. Okay, so here we have a sort of summary of what's going on here in the ventricles. So what we were just talking about with preload and end diastolic volume is that if we're increasing venous return to the heart, so we're increasing how fast and how high pressure blood is coming back to the heart, we increase preload, increasing end diastolic volume, which increases stroke volume. Okay, increasing end diastolic volume increases stroke volume, basically because of that Starling curve that we saw. The other way we're affecting stroke volume can be through increased sympathetic activity, which is increasing the contractility of our cardiac muscle fibers, basically by letting in more calcium mainly. Finally, afterload, our arterial pressure, has effects on stroke volume, which is that low pressure in the aorta means that it's easier for the heart to beat against that pressure, so that increases stroke volume. So kind of as a whole here, right, if we're linking up this afterload part, the arterial stuff and the venous part, if we have blood rushing through our organs, right, moving fast out of the aorta, that would lower our arterial pressure as we're rushing to get that blood out to our organs, but it might speed up the venous return, right, because this is a circuit. So these two things would be a little bit linked as well. Okay, so that's what we have for today. Feel free to watch this linked YouTube video on your own time. It's basically a summary of, sorry, it's longer than we have here, but it's a summary of cardiac output. You know, a little bit shorter, briefer form. I think it's a pretty good one. Okay. So on Wednesday, we will focus entirely on review for the exam. So come with your questions.